Good evening. All right, so we are finishing up our study on the Christian home and family. So Miss Shirley was asking, and I'm sure Jesse may have more to say about this later, but Romans picks up next Wednesday, 2 quarters. So for 2 quarters, we'll be studying Romans, and Brother Jesse Flowers will be teaching that. So there is a book prepared for that. So last week, we stopped with what can we learn about parenting from Hebrews 5 and verse 14. Nope, we ended here. How do you handle an infant that is disruptive in worship services? How do you handle a toddler that is disruptive in worship services? So we've already talked about that. So I found this article from David Sproul that I just wanted to share, and it was the 11 B's for training children in and for worship. And obviously this is something that's a huge deal. Especially with the young ones, what's the best way to handle that? So he says, training children to sit and to behave in worship can be a challenge, but it is a challenge worth taking and mastering for the child's good, for your good, and for the church's good. Children have been a part of God's assembly since Old Testament times. To properly train them and nurture them in the ways of the Lord, children need to be raised in worship assemblies and properly instructed in the behavior and demeanor of worship. So number 1, be ready. Prepare your child, starting the night before, to focus on worshiping God. Talk about it, pray about it. Before worship starts, go to the restroom and get that out of the way. And that's not just for worship services, that's for Bible class too, parents. Before your Bible class starts, if your kids have an issue of going to the bathroom too much, take them before Bible class starts. So that's part of being prepared, being ready. Number 2, be insistent. You're the parent and your child is the child, not vice versa. Set high expectations for your child's behavior. They will achieve them with your help and encouragement. And this is something that the Waldrons dealt with in their book, A Generation That Knows Not God. Oftentimes we set the expectations so low, they're going to meet that. So let's make sure that we're the parents and we're setting the expectation where it needs to be. Number 3, be consistent. Once you have a set and communicated your expectations to your child about behavior and worship, enforce them and do so regularly and uniformly. Inconsistent discipline confuses a child rather than comforts. That's just in general. With children, you got to be consistent, but even in worship services. Number 4, be involved. Involve yourself in all aspects of the worship and assist your child in participating as well to the extent to which they are able. Set a good example. This is a great one. Obviously, if you expect your child to act a certain way, you have to act that way. You have to make sure that you're participating in all of the aspects of the worship service. That's the best way for them to learn. Number 5, be practical. Find ways your child appropriate to his or her age to be appropriately active in the worship. Children can sing, pray, give, and should be taught to do so. Sermon time should not be playtime. Use Bible books and activity sheets for the young and simple sermon notes for the older. And I know when our kids were younger, I forget what it was called, but it's a cloth Bible that they would have. But this is not a time, for snacks and for activities. This is a time for worship, and so we have to teach them that. From a very, very young age. Number 6, be up front. The further back you sit, the more distractions there will be to challenge for your children's attention and yours. Sitting near the front helps keep focused on the services, and always face the front too. We all know this. All right, I was the kind of student, I know what I was like, and so in class, I would always go to the front because I had to eliminate distractions. And I stand in the back, and there are distractions, and so the further back you go, the more people you have in front of you, the more distractions are going to be there. So that's just common sense right there. So sit as close to the front as you can. I think with children, oftentimes we want to get to the very back because we don't want our children to be a distraction. But we need to try to take distractions away from them as well. Number 7, be sensitive. While your child's misbehavior, talkativeness, or constant stirring may not bother you, be mindful of others sitting around you, near you or behind you who are trying to worship. And we talked about that some. Obviously, we at this congregation, we all know and we expect children are going to act like children, and so we're going to be respectful of that, and we're not going to demean a parent that's going through a difficult situation. But at the same time, as a parent, if your child is continually being disruptive, then that needs to be dealt with, and there needs to be some discipline. Number 8, be humble. Seek advice from older Christians whose children behave appropriately in worship. Humbly consider and any counsel offered to you. Those of us that are older and have been in your shoes are more than happy to help, talk about our mistakes and things that we've done, and I know the older ones here would too. But I've seen situations, and I've been a part of situations where people come and talk to you and ask for advice, and then they'll ask maybe somebody else for advice that their children haven't been the greatest example, and then they want to follow that as opposed to following an older person that their children did a great job. That don't even make good nonsense, okay? Number 9, be prayerful. Don't try to bring your child up without the Lord's help. Pray for wisdom, understanding, and courage. And that's a huge one that we all need to be praying for each other and obviously praying for ourselves as well. Number 10, be patient. No child is or will ever be perfect. Even your greatest efforts will be met with resistance and even failure. Don't give up. Don't give in. Stay the course. And then number 11, be big picture focused. In the midst of all the little details, keep your eyes on the ultimate goal, raising one of God's children to grow to love Him and to go home to Him. So I thought that was pretty good, and I think that's good advice for especially those that are younger parents and still in the midst of trying to raise young ones to act appropriately in worship services. So any comments on that before we move on to number 7? All right, number 7, Mark Twain once said, when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. So my question is it appropriate for a teenager to ask his parents why when the teenager is told something they don't like? If so, what is an appropriate response from the parents in this situation? So is that an appropriate question? Norm P.?
That's in fact, at 14, what they're starting to comprehend is why. Up until that point, it's you simply do because you're trying to form habits, but they don't have the capacity to then reason because they're children. And at 14, they're beginning that transition towards adult where the capacity to reason, to ask why, to understand why is there. And so if they ask why, that's a total opportunity to start explaining some of the reasons why. And it should build on all the things that they have done up until that point. Why do we do this? Because of this. Well, why then do we do that? Well, because this leads to that. So that you can build upon their reasoning in the Lord.
Okay. So Norm P says yes. Norm A?
Ditto on the, I agree. From the standpoint that we're talking about as a teenager, they are now getting into the age of accountability. And you're asking them to make a decision. You're asking them to grow their faith without understanding the whys associated with that and being able to come to a biblical answer for themselves to answer that question. Then they're not ready. They're not ready to become a Christian. And so the earlier you can start having meaningful discussions and answering some of those questions, the better.
Okay. Others? Jesse?
I said it's okay to ask questions to perhaps gain a better understanding, but it needs to be done respectfully.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Not in a way that challenges authority or is just disrespectful. But, and if it wasn't, that would need to be addressed.
All right. Amen. Other thoughts? So y'all hit on everything that I had down here. My first answer is depends on how they ask. And I still believe even with teenagers, sometimes the correct answer is because I said so. And that's perfectly fine in certain situations. That is not okay in every situation. Because if we are trying to train our children to develop their own faith, and yet every time they ask us a question why, and we say because I said so, they're not going to develop their own faith. And so if we can't answer their questions appropriately, then they're going to have a hard time developing their own faith. And so we can, like we just talked about with the young ones, we can bring them to worship services, but when they get older and start asking these questions and having these things come up in their own minds, then we have to be able to respond to that, and we have to be able to explain to them in a way that they're going to be able to understand. And I think that is part of parenting. Now, I don't have the experience. We've only got one teenager, and so I don't have the experience that a lot of you have. So anybody have any specific experience or input on teenagers, Ms. Shirley?
You better hope they do ask questions.
Yeah, she said you better hope they do ask questions. Yeah, hopefully that they are communicating with you and they have still enough trust and faith in you to ask you those questions, because I promise you they're probably asking questions, so let's hope they're asking those questions to their parents and not just to their friends. But we are going to run into situations where, yeah, the 14, 15, 16-year-old is going to think that mom and dad, they don't know squat. And they're going to have Rehoboam, that they're going to go with the advice of the younger. So that's something that we're going to have to deal with. Bonnie?
And it's something you continuously have to teach and work at, because even when you think they should have this one thing down, like this past week, Jude asked me a question, and I'm like, what? Don't you know the answer? Like, it was like, you would think, like, because of the pattern that we've done with him, you know, throughout all the years, that he should know the answer to this. And then it just, it's like, I don't know, it's always, you always are teaching. It never stops. So.
Yes. Anything else? All right, number 8, what responsibility do parents have toward their children once they leave home? Jesse?
Well, of course, to continue to love them, to encourage them, especially in continuing to serve God and following the teachings of the Bible, to share wisdom and knowledge and give counsel when it's desired and appropriate to give.
Okay. So when it's appropriate to give advice. Norm A, and then we'll get Sam.
Just simply be available.
Okay. Sam?
I think responsibility is to leave them alone a little bit sometimes. Like they're done. I don't want to say done being raised. Maybe I do mean that, but now they're becoming their own person, and you need to trust that you raised them correctly.
So yes, this is true, but they're not done being raised. And at 43, like I would seek my parents' advice, and of course I was in a little different situation because I was married at 18 and gone from the house. And so the relationship changes. All right, once your child, boy or girl, is an adult, the relationship is going to change. I think that it doesn't change to the extent that you're not going to try and correct them. Again, it's going to be a different type of correction now that they're adults. But if you see something that they're heading down a wrong path, then the parent, if you love them, you're going to continue to correct them. And as you get older, I think that you respect that and you appreciate that. But yes, it can be taken too far if the parent doesn't change the relationship and think that, well, you still got to do things the way that I'm going to do things. We talked about this in the very beginning of class. When that marriage occurs, we've talked about leaving and cleaving, and there's a new family now. And so the man of that house is the head of that house, not that man's father or that man's mother. And so the relationship has to change. And I think that it's probably going to be different with different children as well, and personalities, how involved maybe you still need to be. JJ?
By a woman in her late 80s, probably about 4 years ago in class, that she has children in their 60s, obviously, right? And she said, you don't ever stop worrying about them. And I think going back and connecting that to the teenage years, really, I think the greatest challenge is, regardless of, you can cover all your bases and teach everything, you can set a pretty decent example, you're going to have to be prepared for this person to make some mistakes. The wisdom that comes in is knowing which mistakes you can kind of step back and let them make that are not catastrophic. And then sometimes you just have to make an intervention. But it's a lot like your 2-year-old, your baby when they're walking. For a while you hold their hands till they get stable and they can, that's kind of what I mean. Sometimes, if they're on the grass, you can let the hands go. But that's probably, for me at least, the hardest of that.
Yeah, the relationship, and I've not been to this point outside of with my own parents, but the relationship changes to the point where it's almost like your child is now your peer as opposed to your dependent. Hopefully whenever the child is grown, they're not still your dependent. Then you probably have some more issues, but it's more of this is your fellow brother or sister in Christ, and you're going to help them in that regard, but they're also your child, and so yes, you're going to continue to worry about them. Clarissa?
I agree with everything that's been said. Obviously, if you have married, you are starting your own family, you're leaving and cleaving, and so the parents should definitely take a step back as far as any role in that. And if you're a working on your own adult, like Sam and Maddie, you know, that's obviously changed their relationship with their parents in regards to how much the parents have a say. But I know, I mean, even with some of our college kids, they're 18, they're adults, they're away from home, but a lot of them are being financially and still emotionally supported by their parents, so there still needs to be a respect, and I guess somewhat of an obedience, though, that those kids still owe their parents because they're still somewhat dependent on them, even though they're not under their household all the time. And I mean, I know that I even had that when I was in college, and they had every right to now that I'm adult, but like they didn't want me to get back with this. You know, there was just a situation and they're like, if you are going to pursue this, then we are not going to keep paying for school. And, you know, like they had to kind of lay down the law, in, even though I'm not under their household. And they had every right to make those because they were supporting me. As far as my school, I was paying for everything else, but still I think that there is a part of that, and so there's a responsibility of the adult kids to their parents in that respect, because they're not on their own sometimes for a while.
Clarissa's getting into the next lesson too, talking about how you help your kids.
Through to Mary, her parents stepped in with one of them boyfriends. Norm?
My parents is not something that expires as a child. As someone who's, if you have children and you understand that for your parents, then the easiest way to make that for your children is to be honorable. As the adult, as the parent, be honorable. Make it easier for them to honor you as their parents. And that's a wholly different set of tasks and stuff that you have to do, because as much as you will want to look at your children as your children still, God's very clear. He's first. And you have the responsibility with them until they're there. And then when they're adults, you have to make that change. Now they are a fellow Christian. And if they've chosen not to take that route, other Christians now take priority because they're now self-sufficient and able to go on their own path and walk away from everything you might have taught them. And that shift in your own thinking is a challenge. That might be what is in front of you and the decisions you have to make. And so when you look at being somebody who is honorable, they can always look to and easily follow something that God has laid down for them for their whole life.
Yeah, a couple of the last notes I have here.
Is that there's no age limit in the biblical command to honor your parents, but at the same time, honor doesn't necessarily mean that an adult child has to do everything that his parents ask as well. Again, there is a new family there, but I think we did a pretty good job with that one. Any other comments before we move into our last?
So tell us more of the back.
Yeah, talk more about that.
We have another lesson with that.
All right, so this one is focusing on problems that face families specifically today. So there was a Sunday school teacher that was trying to help her 8-year-old students understand what heaven was like. Just, you know, when you're dealing with younger kids, you try to put things in perspective for them so to really help them understand. And so the teacher concluded her discussion by saying, I like to compare heaven to my home, a place filled with love where I can find peace and acceptance. Yes, heaven is like being at home. And there was one little boy that looked at her with big, serious eyes and says, "If heaven is like my home," he responded, "I don't want to go there." There was a research that was done by 2,000 different people, Christians, that were given the top 10 issues that were facing their family. And the results, number 1 was anti-Christian culture. Number 2 was divorce. Number 3 was busyness. Number 4 was an absent father figure. Number 5, a lack of discipline. Number 6, financial pressures. Number 7, lack of communication. Number 8, negative media influences. Number 9, balance of work and family. And number 10 was materialism. So some of that is where I come up with some of this. And then there are a couple of other studies that all of these are listed as issues as well. And so how do families combat the potential problems that are listed here? And I say give scripture references to support your answer. So we've talked about time quite a bit, so I'm not going to skip that. We've talked about that in other lessons. And we've talked about some with the finances. But what's something just very quickly with finances that, you know, would help families and not have to deal with the issues that come along with that? Ken?
Okay.
Set aside your contribution or whatever off the top, and then use the rest to take care of your other needs.
Okay. All right. We know.
We need to put our trust in God. We can't put our trust in money. And so some of that just has to do with being willing to put our trust in God. All right, so a big one in 2024, obviously, is social media. So how do families combat the problem with social media? And this can be with kids, this can be with adults. So how do families combat that? Jesse?
Well, number 1, don't allow your children to be on it. And
That seems pretty easy.
I mean, a lot of parents allow their children to be on social media at a very young age, and I don't know if there's an age everybody would agree with, even in Lord's church, but they need to be older, they need to be more mature to be able to handle that.
Okay. So don't let your kids own it. Sam?
That's what I was gonna say.
Bonnie?
But it's even a problem for adults. I mean, I agree, you should very limit what your children are allowed to be on, but it's a mindset that you have to have some maturity to have. First of all, you have to just be thankful, because I think like one of the biggest things with social media is you look at what all these people are posting, which may or may not be the reality of their lives, but you could be envious and jealous, and you have to be thankful. Remember like the blessings that you have, count your blessings, and be content. The Bible teaches that in Philippians, you know, be content with what you have, and, you know, just be thankful for, just remind yourself of all that you're able to do and what you have. So it's a problem for adults and children, I think.
Yeah. I mean,
This is obviously a problem on the child side, because they're not mentally capable of processing all of the things that are going to come across social media. But it's a problem for families, because with adults as well, because that will go back to the time aspect even, because you've got, you know, husbands and or wives that spend so much time on social media, and that's become such a huge part of their life that it's grown in importance to them, where it takes away from the family. Clarissa, did you have your hand up? Lena?
I would agree with Bonnie that first of all you have to set the limits for your own self. There are so many people when you go to a restaurant that don't look at each other, don't talk to each other, but they look into their phones while they're waiting on their food, while they're eating, and so on. If you start with yourself and set your own limits, like you can only be on your device from this time to this time, or when you are alone and you are not with the family, it will go to the children as well. Other thing, it's maybe not social media, more as games. I've heard a lot of parents complaining, well, my children are just on their PlayStation all the time. They're playing. Why do you even own it if you complain? Remove it from your house, and then there will be no PlayStation time.
Yeah, be the parent.
Go ahead, Maddie.
Educating your kids on like how it can affect you like negatively. Like you see all these people posting like their perfect pictures. Like sometimes that can get to you. Like if you're not careful, and then you start wishing your life looked more like other people's.
Yeah, and that's not just for kids, that's
With adults too. You see these families that are posting about, it makes it appear as though their family is perfect and they're going on all of these vacations, and you get jealous and, well, my family isn't perfect, and my family can't go on all these vacations, because that seems to be all that they post about, and it can affect us as adults as well. So there was a study that was done, or this is according to the news site, The Hill. It says the CDC says the number of LGBTQ students went from 11% in 2015 to 26% in 2021. How do we get to a point where 1 in 4 teens is openly identifying as LGBTQ? It is the pressure of social media. For the first time in history, our children have a popularity-based system of measuring their worth. What matters is not how many of my friends compliment me or invite me to hang out. What matters is how many likes my post gets from complete strangers. The more shocking the post, the better the reception. And then they say, evil company corrupts good morals. What kind of company are your kids keeping online? So just very quickly, some advice with social media. Be careful before you hit send. Could your message get taken the wrong way? Obviously, as Christians, we have to recognize that we bear the name Christ, and so everything that we post is something that could be scrutinized by others. And so make sure that we pay attention to that. Don't vent anger. Obviously, we don't need to be lying. Don't glorify yourself. Watch out for ungodly influences, which we've talked about, which can very easily happen. Don't let this become an addiction. So like Linda, set some limits for yourself even. Protect your marriage. Use social networking to God's glory. So this is definitely a big one that we have to worry about. All right, what about pornography? So how do families combat the potential problem with pornography?
The state of Tennessee kind of working on some of that right now, interestingly, but truly speaking, that's the kind of thing that to a large degree can be shut out. Is obviously, loopholes and things that slip, but it's a matter of being proactive. Everything on the list is really something to be proactive about, right?
all right, so put some blockers out there. Norm?
Cut out TV. Like, most things on TV, regular programming, commercials, every day, are normal part of the day of life 20 years ago would have been considered pornography. Just the brazenness of how far just regular media, regular TV broadcast will go. And you can cut out a whole bunch of that by just, we're not going to watch TV. There's plenty other services and shows and media available that you can consume that doesn't have any of those types of commercials, that don't have any of those types of programming, writing built into them that you can avoid. And maybe the hard part is, as a parent, you're going to actually have to watch these shows yourself first, so that you can screen them and make sure that they're something that, your kids can watch. Really boring. Could be very boring. But as a parent, you're the one that should have the sense of good and evil to know that, this is appropriate for my kids, or know that this is absolutely ridiculous. There's no way I would show my kids this. But if you don't know, it's better to be bored and see it first, rather than oops. Because regular TV, you can be found with a bunch of oops today.
So outside
Of TV, so extremetech.com estimates that about 30% of all data transferred over the internet is pornography. That's a lot. And so literally it's on hundreds of millions of pages, and that's going to include all of your social media sites, So Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these things are pornographic images are being shown on these. And so one of the things that goes along with social media and this idea of pornography too is when you give your child that phone, you just handed them the devil. And if you don't set limits and blocks on that, because trust me, the kids are a lot smarter than we ever were when we were young. All right, and they can figure out ways to get around things. And this is a very serious problem when it can happen unintentionally. All right, your child could not be intending to end up where they ended up. And then once they end up there, and if they're not strong enough to push it away, then it keeps coming and it keeps happening, and now we've got an addiction. And so what's one of the problems, there's a lot of them, but what's one of the problems with pornography in regards to trying to train young men and young women for the marriage relationship? Norm?
Gives a false sense of what all of the emotions are, what the realities of just living are. I mean, it's a complete fabrication of life. So again, it's like they try to. Somebody tries to tell you, oh, that's, you want to educate your kids, make sure they know what to do. When they get married and stuff. That's not the place to do that.
Marissa?
It's an addiction. So not only are you competing conceptually with a spouse, but also in terms of time. It will take up a lot of time that you should be spending together.
Bonnie?
And studies have shown that it is, like she says, it's an addiction, but it is also, it becomes like almost a necessity for, sexual fulfillment. And it just gets worse and worse. Like you always have to have something worse or, something greater than what you're watching, and just, it's a downward spiral.
I see it. Kim?
Yeah, it cheapens a relationship. A man starts to look at a woman in a way that, he just looks at her as an object more than a person, more than someone who desires to, or deserves to be loved and respected, and it cheapens that whole process.
All right, Mark?
There is nothing in the entire industry of pornography that is any way, in any shape or form, even partially or tangentially related to godliness. It takes everything that God has put down in the Bible and in the most grotesque way perverts it, and then displays it and glorifies it. There is no greater death to any type of godliness than pornography, just in how everything is portrayed, from the relationships between the people involved, to the acts that they are committing. There's nothing in it that is holy or godly, and there is nobody who has ever produced anything in that entire industry that has ever been godly.
So just some data.
So the teens online, 70% have come across porn accidentally over the web. 9 out of 10 children have teens between the ages of 8 and 16 who have viewed pornography on the web, usually while doing homework or using a search engine. 90% of teens and young adults have gone online, and half of them go online once a day or more. 3 out of 4 young people have access at home, and then 1 in 3 have access from their own bedroom, totally unsupervised. And I think that oftentimes this is viewed as a society as more of a male problem and not a problem with women. So this is an article that was talking about women in porn, and it says 1 out of every 6 women, including Christians, struggle with pornography addiction. It says they're mostly involved more with chat rooms, while men are involved with images and videos online. This is a huge problem. This is a huge problem within the church. Do not be naive to think that this is not a problem with Christians as well. And so the things that we have to do, obviously, we've got to use filters, put the block on there like JJ talked about. And as far as parents, we've got to make sure that we have parental control over all of our children's devices. And I think that another part of it is we've got to talk about it. we can't be so naive that, well, we don't want to talk to our kids about it. We need to talk to them about this and talk to them about a healthy sexual relationship between a husband and a wife and what that looks like and what the expectation is there, and that this is not it. And everybody hit on it. Pornography distorts the view of the correct view of sexuality. And so we need to talk about these things and be open about these things with our kids. If it happens accidentally, then we want our children to be communicating with us about those things as well. Miss Rhoda?
When I was probably in the 7th, maybe the 8th grade, and some girls, I think we were in the gym as a matter of fact, but they came and asked me a question. And I said, well, I don't know, but I'll ask my mother. And they about fainted. They said, ask your mother. I said, well, if she knows, she'll tell me. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was along one of those lines there. I don't distinctly remember. But I think I remember telling my mother that they asked me, and I said, I just thought I'd ask you.
And hopefully we maintain that open book
policy with our kids. And part of that open book policy, too, is when your kids have a device, you still own the device, and that means that you're going to be able to view their text and view their social media and view everything that they got going on. Tiffany?
I think that nowadays people forget that marriage is meant to be pure. And so, you know, you hear of OnlyFans. I don't know if you guys have heard of that or not, but it is basically you can, you know, put yourself out there on media and you can pay a subscription. And the more you pay, the more images you see, the more, you know, flesh you see, up until the point that a man or a woman is completely without anything. You know, women nowadays have made millions on that. But if you're married and you put yourself out there, you're not pure anymore. You know, I mean, your images are out there all over the World Wide Web for everyone to see. It's scary how easy that something like that can spread.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the devil is not dumb. God created us to be sexual beings, and sex sells. And so it's something that we have to be aware of. All right, the next one, same-sex attraction. So how do we combat that within our families? Sam?
I think for I guess most issues, most things that we as Christians consider pretty degenerate, homosexuality is one that I think is heavily fought for from people of the world, to the point that they argue that it's not wrong, that there's nothing wrong with it. So I think what's important, especially with kids, is to really nail down the fact that it is wrong. And when you hear the argument, I was made this way, I was born this way, maybe just circumventing that argument entirely by saying, you know, it doesn't matter, it's wrong, and it's irrelevant whether you think you were made that way or not. It's explicitly commanded in scriptures that you don't do that, and there's consequences of that, and you shouldn't be doing it. I feel like that's really important to say when your kid's in a society where there's tons of people who say the opposite.
Yeah, so we've got to make sure we're clear with our
children. And one of the things that I think is being pushed with our society, even with young children, is, well, how do you feel? Well, do you feel like you're a boy or a girl, regardless of what biology and God said that you were? How do you feel? And so we have to make sure that we're able to teach our children. We can have certain feelings, but truth isn't based on feelings. And so feelings and truth, they may not always line up. So just because you feel like a girl when you're biologically a male, I don't care how you feel. This is what truth says. And starting from the very beginning with our children and helping them understand this is the design of God. We were made in the image of God. We were made male and female. And yes, talk about the sinful nature of some of these things. But again, part of this is just being open and honest and upfront with our children. Norm, real quick.
The biggest way to combat this is to actually normalize and explain to children that it is okay to have friendships. And friendship is an important and very deep relationship that you can absolutely have with anyone in the world, people of the same sex or the opposite sex. And that is absolutely lost in today's conversation. If you have feelings for somebody, it's because you love them and you need to be in bed with them. And you can absolutely love somebody and not go to bed with them, whether they're your sex or somebody else's, and be a great friend with them and have a really deep, long-lasting, and powerful relationship with them. And we need to make sure that that relationship is something that our children also understand. That it is permissible to have those relationships. That it is not something that you would marry over. Because that is a very specific and singular relationship that is apart from the friendships. And you could have many friendships over your life with many different people. But you're only going to have one spouse. And if we can differentiate that, because the world makes no distinction, but we need to, so they can be willing to make those friendships that will last throughout their lives, as well as having that marriage that will last throughout their life.
All right, so real quick on suicide. How do we combat that? Because this is a big one with our especially with the young in today's society. Lena?
Since you said give some scripture, I try to answer everything with the scriptures. So I put there is suicide, although there is nothing specific in the Bible about suicide. Suicide is a murder, and the Bible condemns it. We studied that in Exodus 20:13. And also I put there that suicide reveals a belief that God is not powerful to help you solve your problems. And I put 1 Corinthians 10:13, where it says that God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able.
Okay, so what's one of the biggest causes of suicide?
Addiction. And just a general self-loathing for whatever reason. And sometimes that's connected.
Yes. I think a lot of it boils down to self-worth.
And someone feels like, well, I'm not worth anything. And so part of that is from a young age, we have to teach our children the value of being made in the image of God and the value of each soul. And so again, we've got to start that from a very young age. And not that we want our children to be proud or prideful, but we also have to teach them to have a certain amount of self-esteem because you are made in the image of God. Ken?
This is an example of suicide.
Yeah, there's 6 or 7 examples of suicide actually in the Bible.
Really?
So this is the last question that I asked. So I said, how does your family life compare to God's expectations of you and your family? So we're going to start here and just work our way around. All right. So we're not going to do that, but I'm dead serious with this question. So we've just spent a whole quarter talking about God's expectations really with a Christian home and family, what our roles are as husbands and as wives and as mothers and as fathers. And we've had great discussion, and I've appreciated it very much. But just because we've sat here and talked about it and we know what the scriptures say, it doesn't mean anything unless we actually do it. And so if we're short in any area of what we have talked about as a husband or as a wife or as a mother or as a father, then we need to make those corrections. And so that's what I would encourage each of you to do, to examine yourself, examine your family, and if you're not meeting God's expectations, then you need to make some changes. Because in order to have a strong church, we need strong families, and God expects that of us. And so I would encourage each of us to look within our own families, look within our own selves, and make sure that we are living up to God's expectations for us and not living by our own. Andy?
It's a work in progress. But if we stop working, then we'll never have any progress.
That's right.
I was just gonna say pretty much what he said, except, some questions I'm like, oh yeah, we're good at that. And then another one, oh wow, that was really bad, and it's constant. You just have to be aware of what it's supposed to be and work on it.
That's right. Keep working on it.
Thanks, everybody. I've enjoyed the class.